Want to know if your English skills are improving and what your real learning level is? Get your language skills assessed with our free level assessment test. Just click the link in the description and sign up for a free lifetime account to get assessed. Hey everybody, welcome back to Ask Alisha, the weekly series where you ask me questions and I answer them. Maybe. Let's get to your first question this week. First question this week comes from Jovi Chavez. Hi Jovi. Jovi says, hello Alisha. About storytelling. What is the best tense I should use when writing a novel, short story, or feature story? Because I usually notice authors tend to use past tense, mostly in novels, but others say it's better to use present tense because it's more powerful for readers. So I'm kind of torn. Thanks in advance. I enjoy watching you. Take care. Good question. So with storytelling, it's kind of tricky because there's no, as you suggested, there's no perfect answer for every story, right? For every story you want to tell, if it's a news story or a novel or a short story or a poem, maybe, right? So there's no one perfect answer here. But what you really need to think about is the reader's experience, right? What do you want the reader to feel? So for example, a general kind of guide you can follow is that if you are reporting something, like a news story, for example, just use past tense, right? So you need to report the facts of a story. It's past tense generally when we watch the news on TV or on the internet, and it's generally past tense when we read articles written about the news. But you might have noticed that occasionally there are parts of the story that are written in present tense, right? It'll be simple present tense something like a schedule maybe, and then there'll be part that's like a progressive tense section as well. So there are some choices that writers make to choose kind of a different feel just for a moment in the story. So we do this a lot in just everyday, very casual storytelling in our speech, and this also kind of goes into our writing as well. If there's a moment that you really want the reader to feel, like you want them to feel a moment of action, for example, or like they're really in the moment in that story, feeling something that the character is feeling in the story, the writer might choose to shift to a present tense grammar structure. So they do this because it sounds like it's happening right now. When we use past tense, it tends to feel like just a report of something that happened. When we use that present tense grammar structure, we can kind of create a feeling of something happening right now. So this is the reason that you might notice that there kind of tend to be a few different tenses that we use generally for storytelling. But generally, yeah, we choose to focus mainly on a past tense way of telling the story, or in some cases, a present tense way of telling the story. You might see, for example, something called choose your own adventure stories. If you have read any kind of English book that's intended for young people, usually like teenagers, you might see a lot of those choose your own adventure stories, which are books where you can change the story, change the storyline, depending on which page you turn to. You have to make decisions as a reader. Those books are usually written in a present tense grammar structure because they want the reader to feel that they are experiencing the story and making decisions for themselves that change the story. So that's an example, an extreme example of when we might use a present tense grammar structure to tell the story. But generally, I would say when I read novels and when I read, of course, news articles, short stories, essays, and so on, they tend to use more past tense, and then there are moments of present tense here and there, just to kind of maybe emphasize certain parts of the story. So there's not a perfect answer, always use this tense for this situation. It's more about, like what I said at the beginning, thinking about what you want your reader to feel. So I hope that this answers your question. I hope that this gives you kind of a guide to think about as you continue in your writing. So thanks very much for this interesting question and good luck with your storytelling. Okay, let's move on to your next question. Next question comes from Shoko. Hi Shoko. Shoko says, I want to know the difference between how about you and what about you, and the difference between how do you think and what do you think. How should I use them? Okay, so how about you and what about you? Let's start there. So how about you and what about you? We tend to use a lot in like those self-introduction situations, like, this is what I do for work. What about you? Or how about you? So in kind of this surface level, like self-introduction situation where it's very clear, the conversation topic, you can use how about you and what about you. in kind of the same way. It's very clear, right, what we're asking the other person for. But in kind of deeper conversations, how about you and what about you take on kind of different feels. So when you're in a business meeting situation, for example, and you say to someone like, how about you? It sounds kind of unnatural. Even if you want that person's opinion, it sounds a little bit unnatural to say, how about you? Because it's sort of like that's a question that we ask when the answer is very easy, yeah? Like, what's your job or what are your hobbies? It feels like a very surface level question, or maybe it's a question that we can kind of already expect the answer to. It's going to be an easy to understand answer. On the other hand, what about you? Sounds more like it's inviting the other person to share some opinions a little bit more than how about you. So if you're in a business meeting sharing proposals or sharing your opinions about proposals, and you say something like, well, I think X, Y, and Z about this proposal. What about you? It sounds kind of like you're inviting the person for their opinion. In my case, I feel that how about you sounds a little more surface level. I don't feel the same sense that someone is inviting me to share my opinion as much with how about you. It could be the case. It just sounds like a more casual kind of question in that situation. So I think that would be kind of the simplest way I could break down the differences between how about you and what about you. What about you, for me, tends to feel more like you're inviting someone to share a little bit more depth than just how about you. But again, depending on your connection with your coworkers and your friends and your teammates, maybe you use them more similarly. But I want to go on to the next part of your question, which is how do you think and what do you think? First, I want to just express that how do you think is not a pattern that we use as a set question. We don't say how do you think. We sometimes use how do you think this could be done? How do you think blah, blah, blah? We could use how do you think as the beginning of a question, like how do you think we could get to the beach this weekend? Or how do you think we could save enough money for our vacation in the next 3 months, you know? So you could use how do you think as the beginning of a question, but we do not use how do you think as a question asking about the other person's opinion. So remove that from your vocabulary if you use that. We don't say, how do you think? What do you think is the correct question to ask here when you want someone's opinion. So dinner plans, what do you think? Or vacation plans, what do you think? Great, ask that question. But we do not use how do you think to ask for someone's opinion unless it's at the beginning of a bigger question. How do you think blah, blah, blah? How do you think we should do this? Or how do you think I should style my hair? And so on. So that's the beginning of a how question. So I hope that that's a pretty quick answer to this how do you think, what do you think difference. So in sum, how about you and what about you? Very, very similar questions. I feel what about you tends to elicit or tends to get a deeper response and invites a deeper opinion sharing than how about you. And what do you think is the correct question to ask when asking for someone's opinion? How do you think should only be used as the beginning of a longer question? So thanks very much for sending this question, Shoko. I hope that I answered it. But let's move on to our next question. Next question comes from Roman Matovsky. Hi, Roman. Roman says, when do I have to use bear and when do I have to use have? Interesting question. Bear versus have. This might be a new verb for some people. To bear, B-E-A-R. So the same spelling as like the very big dangerous creature that lives in the forest. But to bear something usually means to carry something, often very heavy, or to carry something emotionally very heavy. So it has this feeling of weight. Oh gosh, it's like something that is really tough to carry in our heart or physically too. So when we bear something, we have something that is very important to us, like a physical object that is very important, very valuable, like maybe it's something that belongs to a king or a queen, like he is the ring bearer is a good example, a really common example in modern weddings. Like the person who carries the rings at the wedding is called the ring bearer. So the person who bears, who holds the rings. So the rings are very important. They have special value, right? So we use to bear when we're talking about things things that are very valuable and very important, or maybe they're also just really, really heavy. But we tend to use it more, I feel, when they're kind of important things. So I want to talk now about the bear that we use to talk about the emotions that we carry. We typically use these with negative or very challenging, difficult emotions, like grief or stress or intense responsibility. So here's an example sentence. We usually follow this to bear with a noun that refers to an emotional state. So for example, she bears the grief of her husband's passing. So in that sentence, grief is a noun, but it talks about those negative or those very difficult and challenging emotions connected to sadness and loss, right? So we tend to use bear when we talk about holding or keeping these very difficult emotions with us. So you might say, yeah, she bears this great responsibility in her work, or she has to bear a lot of stress in her job, something like that. We typically use it when we talk about things that are very, very challenging for us emotionally. So bear has a very kind of heavy meaning generally. It carries a lot of meaning because when we use it to talk about physical objects, they're very valuable or very important generally, or very heavy sometimes too. But we also use it to talk about those difficult and challenging emotions. So maybe you can see then have is a much more general verb, right? Have doesn't always mean carry either. I mean, we can use it to talk about everyday objects, right? I can say, I have my smartphone in my hand. I would not say, I bear my smartphone. That makes it sound like I have way too much importance on my smartphone. It's not that valuable. It's just a phone, right? So have is a much more general word. It's the one that we use when we talk about everyday objects. It's the one that we use when we want to just talk about something we own, right? We don't really say, I bear my car or something like that. It sounds way, way, way too important, it sounds really funny. It makes me laugh, right? So don't use bear for those everyday objects. Use I have a car, right? It sounds much more natural to use the verb have to talk about everyday objects and the things that we own. So I hope that this helps break down kind of the interesting uses of the verb to bear, because we have two main uses for that, for physical things and for emotional things. You might see this a lot in poetry and in other kind of more creative and artistic expressions, especially in writing. So thanks very much for this very interesting question. I hope that that answers it. All right, that is everything that I have for this week. So thank you, as always, for sending your great questions. Remember, you can send them to me at EnglishClass101.com/ask-Alisha. That is a very long URL, so please send them to the link in the description. You can find this link in the description. Send it there. I will definitely see your question. I will probably not see your question if you send it somewhere else. Sorry, there are just too many. So please send it to the official question submission page. I'm always on the lookout for great questions from you. Of course, if you liked this lesson, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. Also, check us out at EnglishClass101.com for some other things that can help you with your English studies. Thanks very much for watching this episode of Ask Alisha, and I will see you again next time. Bye!